And it was very unexpected. And the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has verified that a total of 549 civilians, there's 549 civilian deaths during the Russia's military attack on Ukraine as of March 9th, and 41 of them being children. And the United States intelligence agencies estimate that there's between 2,000 to 5,000 Russian soldiers, other sources saying higher, that have been killed in this 2-week invasion of Ukraine, possibly more than the number of Americans killed in the 20-year war in Afghanistan. And ever since February 24th, there's been 800 Russian missiles that have been fired in Ukraine. And the chaos just continues, and Russia maintains its 40-mile long military convoy and their merciless attacks on Ukrainian cities. And just to kind of give you a visual of that, it's from SPP campus all the way to downtown Los Angeles. So just to kind of give you a glimpse of what that's like. But we have two experts here who will be able to dissect the dimensions of this catastrophic events that's transpired in the last couple of weeks. And first, I'd like to introduce Mr. Ambassador Pifer. He's a William Perry Fellow at Stanford University and non-resident senior fellow in the Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Initiative, Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence, in the Center of the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. He's from January to May 2021, he was a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. He focuses on nuclear arms control, Ukraine and Russia. He has offered commentary on these issues on National Public Radio, PBS NewsHour, CNN, Fox News, BBC, VOA, and his articles have ran in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Financial Times, National Interest, Moscow Times, and Kyiv Post, and many others. He's the author of The Eagle and the Trident, U.S. Ukraine Relations in Turbulent Times, and co-author with Mike O'Hanlon on The Opportunity, Next Steps in Reducing Nuclear Arms. A retired Foreign Service officer, has more than 25 years with the State Department focused on U.S. relations with the former Soviet Union and Europe, as well as arms control and security issues. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Asian Affairs with responsibilities for Russia and Ukraine from 2001 to 2004, was Ambassador of Ukraine from 1998 to 2000, and a Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia in the National Security Council from 96 to 97. In addition to Ukraine, Ambassador Pifer served in the U.S. embassies at Warsaw, Moscow, and London, as well with the U.S. delegation to the negotiation of intermediate range nuclear forces in Geneva. From 2000 to 2001, he was a visiting scholar at Stanford's Institute for International Studies. Thank you, Ambassador Pifer, for being here today.
Thank you.
Yes, and then on the other side, we have Ambassador Fried. In the course of,
I think we're on the same side.
yeah. With Ambassador Fried, in his 40-year Foreign Service career, Ambassador Fried played a key role in designing and implementing American policy in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. As Special Assistant and NSC Senior Director for Presidents Clinton and Bush, Ambassador to Poland, and Assistant Secretary of State for Europe in 2005 to 2009, Ambassador Fried helped craft the policy of NATO enlargement to Central European nations, and in parallel, NATO-Russia relations, thus advancing—
With Steve Pifer, let the record show.
The record acknowledges that, sir. The goal of Europe whole, free, and at peace. During those times, the West community of democracy and security grew in Europe. Ambassador Fried helped lead the West's response to Moscow's aggression against Ukraine starting in 2014. As State Department Coordinator for Sanctions Policy, he crafted U.S. sanctions against Russia, the largest U.S. sanctions program to date, and negotiated the imposition of similar sanctions by Europe, Canada, Japan, and Australia. Ambassador Fried became one of the U.S. government's foremost experts on Central and Eastern Europe and Russia. While a student, he lived in Moscow, majored in Soviet Studies and history at Cornell University, and received MA from Columbia's Russian Institute and School of International Affairs in 1977. He joined the U.S. Foreign Service later that year, serving overseas in Leningrad, Human Rights, Public Affairs, and Consular Officer, and Belgrade, Political Officer, and in the Office of Soviet Affairs in the State Department. Thank you, Ambassador Fried, for being here today.
And I'll briefly note that in addition to working together on the National Security Council, Ambassador Fried was my last senior U.S. government visitor when I was in Kyiv, completing my assignment there in 2000. They
Perfect.
didn't listen, but we tried.
Absolutely. And I'm very glad that you guys know. I thought you would, just want to make sure. But if you guys have any opening remarks, if you want to start out, Ambassador Fried.
I think Steve is going to start out.
Yeah, I think the logic of our order. So let me do 9 or 10 minutes of opening comments and just begin with the motives for this war. During the run-up, the Kremlin tried to frame this as a crisis between NATO and Russia. But that doesn't make any sense. They talked about aggressive expansion by NATO towards Russia's borders. There are now 5 NATO members that border Russia or the Kaliningrad exclave. The last of those countries to join NATO joined in 2004. So why are we having this crisis now, 18 years later? Moreover, Ukraine at this point in time does not have a membership perspective in the alliance, in large part because the Russians occupy Ukrainian territory. And at this point in time, NATO is not prepared to take Ukraine in, because does that mean that NATO is then at war with Russia? And the Russians know this. So this is a false issue. It is much more about Ukraine, and there are several motives here. One is concern in the Kremlin that Ukraine is slipping irretrievably out of Moscow's orbit. The Russians want to have Ukraine in a Russian sphere of influence, where Kyiv will defer to Moscow on big foreign policy issues. But I would note that nothing has done more to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West than Russian policy of the last 8 years, the seizure of Crimea, and then the instigation of a conflict in Donbass, which had killed 14,000 people even before this new invasion broke out 2 weeks ago. There's a second driver behind what Russia's doing, and that's a domestic political concern in Russia, is that for the Kremlin, a Western-oriented, democratic, economically successful Ukraine is a nightmare, because that kind of Ukraine is going to cause Russians to ask why they can't have the same political voice and democratic rights that they have in Ukraine. So this is in part about regime survival for the Kremlin. And a third issue, which I'll come back a little bit later, is emotion. Ukraine is just an emotional issue for Vladimir Putin. Now, I would note before the conflict, Russia showed no real interest in diplomacy. There was an effort by the United States and NATO to create a diplomatic off-ramp, responding to the draft agreements that the Russians proposed back in December. Both Washington and NATO said there are a variety of arms control, risk reduction, confidence, and transparency measures that we can do. And we know how to do these. We did these in the 80s and the 90s, but they could, had the Russians been prepared to negotiate, made a genuine contribution to European security, including to Russia's security. But the Russians kind of swept those aside and said, no, the two key demands are, one, that NATO pledge now never to enlarge again, and two, that NATO withdraw its forces in military infrastructure, relatively small forces, from the territory of those allies who joined the alliance after 1997. And the United States and NATO were simply not prepared to do that. And the Russians then said, well, there's nothing to bargain about, really. My next point would be, this is a war of choice. Ukraine posed no security threat to Russia. The active duty Russian military personnel are 4 times the size of Ukraine's. Russia's defense budget is 10 times the size of Ukraine's. Russia has much more modern equipment, and Russia has 4,400 nuclear weapons. The Ukrainians have 0. And I would note that back in the 1990s, Ukraine had on its territory the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal, but they gave it up in large part because Russia committed to respect their territorial integrity and their sovereignty, and committed not to use or threaten to use force against Ukraine. What you now see, I think, is a Russian military operation that, if you basically drew a line from Kyiv in the north down to Odessa on the Black Sea, it appears aimed at occupying that part of Ukraine. And it also seems that the #1 goal, although they failed to date, is to take Kyiv. And the objectives here seem to be, one, to destroy the Ukrainian military, but also to I believe, to depose the current government. The Russian goals for a ceasefire, this is just for a ceasefire, are fairly maximalist. They say if Ukraine wants a ceasefire, Ukraine must recognize Crimea as Russian territory, must recognize the two so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states, must demilitarize, must accept neutral status, which means not only no NATO, but I believe it also means no European Union. And although it's not said, I'm sure it means also a change in the government. And there's no way that they can expect Ukraine to accept that. In contrast, in the last several days, President Zelensky's put out some hints that there might be a willingness to compromise in Kyiv on issues such as Ukraine's relationship with NATO, and even some compromise unspecified regarding the two People's Republics. That got no positive reaction from the Kremlin. Today in Turkey, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba met with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, and that produced no progress. It did produce a rather remarkable statement by Foreign Minister Lavrov, who said, Russia has not attacked Ukraine. Go figure. I guess I would, in the introductory remarks, take issue with one section. The Russian invasion or the Russian attack was expected. The U.S. intelligence community has been predicting this really since December. I think a lot of us on the outside, I expected Russian military operations beginning in about early January, although the question was, would it be a military operation of this scale? And I think even the Ukrainians did not expect this. When I was in Kyiv at the end of January, the expectation from Ukrainians was either no attack or perhaps a military operation limited to the eastern part of the country around Donbass. But instead, you have this massive attack that is really coming at Ukraine from really north, south, and east. However, it's been described by one military analyst as a bizarre operational plan. The Russians have huge advantages in air power. They haven't really used them. They really don't fight at night. They're having mammoth logistical difficulties. And it looks like originally they thought they could send just small units, including an airborne unit, which had really no backup, and seize Kyiv within a couple of days. And they completely underestimated the resistance from the Ukrainians. Now, having said that, the Russians are regrouping now. It looks like they are now trying to encircle Kyiv. They do have the advantage of mass and numbers. And most analysts I speak to say at the end of the day, that mass and numbers probably wins. What the Ukrainians have on their side, though, is tenacity and determination. And so I still think it's a question if the Russians win. It's not yet a question of when the Russians win. What's been interesting to me is just a whole series of Kremlin miscalculations. They underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian resistance. They made some major mistakes. I mean, one assessment I've heard is that miles-long convoy is basically, that was the convoy that was designed to roll into Kyiv after the small units went in and seized the capital, and it had the support structures for really the occupation of Kyiv. They've been sitting there now for, I think, 10 days, and my sense is probably at this point in time, most of those vehicles are out of gas, the batteries are probably dead, and there are a lot of very cold Russian soldiers because the temperatures are dipping down to minus 20 degrees. And it's just a very bizarre operation. But I think it reflects the fact that the Russians thought that this was going to be a fairly easy fight. The second miscalculation was overestimating Russian military capabilities and what they could do. And then I think a third miscalculation, which Ambassador Fried will address, is really underestimating the Western reaction. First, the strength and the robustness of NATO's response in defense terms, but also a very robust set of sanctions. So why these miscalculations? I think the first question I'd ask is, does the Kremlin really understand Ukraine? And I'm not sure they do. I was in Moscow maybe 10 years ago and had dinner with a fairly senior retired foreign policy official. And I asked him, is there anybody in the Kremlin who understands Ukraine? And he thought for a moment and said, yes, there's somebody who really understands Ukraine very well. And then he said, but nobody listens to him. And I think that's evident. We've seen that. I mean, Putin, for the last 8 or 9 years has talked about we Russians and Ukrainians are one people, which is a really tone-deaf thing to say to Ukrainians who hear that you've just denied our history, our language, our culture. But I do worry about the lack of understanding. It may well result from the fact that Putin tends to operate in a very close inner circle. If you look at the 4 or 5 people that are supposedly in that inner circle, I think all but one come from his own background, from Russian security services, so they very much have a similar worldview. And the question then arises, what information gets to Putin? And is there anybody in that inner circle who's prepared to speak truth to power? You may have seen 2.5 weeks ago when they had this staged Russian Security Council meeting, Sergei Naryshkin, who's the head of the SVR, that's the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, apparently botched his lines and was just humiliated by Putin on national television. Well, Naryshkin is supposedly in the inner circle, so it's a very strange setup. But I also believe that Putin has changed from the Vladimir Putin that we might have known 15 years ago. I mean, he used to be, I thought, pretty calculated in terms of costs versus benefits. And he did take risks, but they were generally manageable risks. Now, I think what you're seeing is a much more emotional and angry Putin, particularly when it comes to Ukraine. I mean, look at the speech he gave on February 24, which was intended to explain to the Russian public why they were recognizing the two breakaway people's republics. But it really is the case for war against Ukraine. And then go back and look at the essay that he published back last summer on Ukraine, which all but denies Ukraine the right to exist as a sovereign state. I wonder also about the impact of COVID. Putin is operating in a closed circle. That circle has become much more compressed in the last couple of years. I think he may be paranoid about COVID. You see these weird pictures where he meets with somebody, but his own ministers, who presumably have been vaccinated, are having to sit 30 feet away. And the last change I think we've seen, he's taking really big risks. I mean, certainly Russia has the most powerful conventional military force in Europe, at least that's what we thought. But Ukraine is the size of Texas. You know, this is a big military operation. Lots of things can go wrong. So briefly, where does this thing go from here? I think if the Russians keep fighting and are not prepared to negotiate, the Ukrainians will resist, and they will keep resisting. Because for many Ukrainians, this fight is almost existential. One, they see if they lose, their democracy is gone. And also the vision that I think is held by lots of 20 and 30-year-olds in Ukraine of becoming a normal European country, say like the Czech Republic, that goes away. They're fighting for that. And so you have this, I think, struggle of determination and courage and tenacity on one side against larger Russian numbers. The Russians appear to be gathering for a siege or an attack on Kyiv. That could be very ugly. We've already seen, I think, as frustration in Moscow has grown, more use by the Russians of indiscriminate attacks with artillery and rockets. And I think one thing people fear is, you know, at the end of the day, if taking Kyiv proves to be hard, do the Russians go and use the tactics they used on Grozny and Chechnya, where they basically leveled the city? Now, if the Russians win, and I put win in quotation marks, then what happens? And this is where I have a hard time figuring out what is Vladimir Putin's end objective, because any pro-Russian government that he installs in Kyiv lasts for 2 minutes after the Russian military leaves. So the Russians are setting themselves up for a year's, perhaps decades-long occupation, which will take a sizable military and security service presence. It will be with a population that is hostile, anti-Russian, angry, and in many cases armed. And I think that carries some big risks for Putin. How does the Russian public react when not only the effect of the sanctions, which Ambassador Fried will describe in a moment, the economic impact, which is going to be very painful, but also when they see, even after they have supposedly won, a continuing stream of Russian casualties coming back to Russia from Ukraine. So I look at that victory, and again, I use that term victory in quotation marks, and the sanctions impact and the political isolation. And that seems to me that that's not much of a victory for Russia. But then I look at what Putin seems to be doing, and he seems to be doubling down. I think, unfortunately, we're likely to see this military conflict continue for some time. And again, though, I think because of what we've seen, both from the underperformance by the Russians and the tenacity of the Ukrainians, that it is still an if question, not a when question of when the Russians might prevail. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you, Ambassador Pifer. And I think you answered half of my questions, but now I'm ready to get into the weeds of things and into the details of what you just shared with us. And if you could, Ambassador Fried, just talk about the aspect of our alliances. So looking at NATO, looking at, you know, the sanctions aspect of everything, not only ours, but the global response to Russia.
Yep. Putin probably believed his own talking points, that the West is weak, Biden was distracted, the US pulled out of Afghanistan in haste and in a bad fashion, and therefore we could be pushed around. He probably believed that, just as the Soviets believed that after the American withdrawal from Vietnam, the US was on the run and they could lean forward and increase their presence all over the world, and the US was not going to be able to withstand them. Turned out badly for the Soviet Union. Not sure it's turning out all that well for Putin. You can understand why Putin thought Europe would not rally to the defense of Ukraine. There was a new German government. The German Social Democrats have traditionally been somewhere between soft and willfully blind about Russian aggression. The French are consumed with a tough re-election campaign for Macron. The British are out of the EU, distracted. Boris Johnson is mercurial. The Poles, who are pretty staunch in resisting Putin's aggression, were isolated in Europe and even fighting with the United States about some things. So you can see how he might have convinced himself that the West was weak. Now, the Biden administration has a lot of people with long experience in Russian affairs, but they made a decision early on last year that China was the most profound challenge to US national security, and they wanted to meet with Putin, which they did in Geneva, and then have the US-Russian relationship go to what they called a stable and predictable place. Not warm and fuzzy, not a new reset, but something on the back burner so the Biden administration could concentrate on China. That's when Putin started to mobilize against Ukraine. And there was no reason. Nothing, neither the US nor the Ukrainians had done anything to precipitate Putin's action. He started building up his military, and I think to the surprise of Putin, the Americans got wind of it, and instead of doing what a lot of US administrations have done, which when their initial assumptions turn out wrong, which is to deny reality, the Biden administration shifted. They sent CIA Director Bill Burns to Moscow, and Bill Burns is a great choice for a quiet emissary. He knows Russia well. He was a Foreign Service officer, our colleague, Steve's colleague and mine, for a long time, ambassador to Russia, worked in the US Embassy Moscow before he was ambassador, so he was a perfect person to talk to the Russians. He was also known as somebody who really did want decent and stable relations with Russia, not known as a hardliner like me. So he came back apparently alarmed. Alarmed about what Russia's intentions were. And the United States very quickly after that made the decision to go public about its concerns and start mobilizing allies. The Europeans were reluctant to understand the dangers of an actual war. The Ukrainians did not accept the possibility of a major attack until the very end. But the fact is, the Biden administration assembled a coalition of European countries and prepared some serious responses in advance. The US and the West generally were much more prepared for Putin's attack on Ukraine than we were in 2008 when the Russians attacked Georgia. The Russo-Georgian War caught us all by surprise, or almost all of us. This attack did not catch the administration by surprise. They had already started supplying the Ukrainians with arms. When they realized an attack was imminent, they accelerated the delivery of arms. In retrospect, they probably should have done more, but they did a lot. Secondly, they prepared a series of sanctions to hit the Russian economy. Now, a word about this, full disclosure. I was the State Department sanctions coordinator in 2014, and I helped design and was chief negotiator the first set of sanctions we put in place when Putin first attacked Ukraine in 2014. Those sanctions were media. They weren't small. They weren't a wrist slap. They hit the Russian economy. But what the Biden administration had planned and put into effect was much stronger. We did big financial restrictions on the Russian state banks. The Biden people prepared to fully block them, meaning blocking all of their assets. Plus, they froze any dealings in Russian state bonds, plus a big export control, not allowing any semiconductors, chips basically, to go to Russia if they're made with US products or US licenses, and that means a lot of chips. Now, the administration rolled these out within the first 3 days of the invasion. And then 2 weeks ago, this coming Saturday, they accelerated and they locked down Russia's foreign exchange reserves. They went after Russia's central bank. And to give you an idea what this means, Putin had built up a war chest of about $630 billion in foreign exchange reserves. That's a lot of money. He thought that was a war chest that enabled him to withstand the other sanctions we were planning. The administration had not planned to go after the Russian central bank. But when they took a look at the size and destruction of the initial days of the war and realized what was happening, and when the Europeans started listening to appeals by Ukrainian President Zelensky to do more, the Americans, in about the space of 36 hours, came up with the idea and worked with the Europeans and put through sanctions by all the G7, the chief industrialized democracies in the world, and slapped them on a Saturday night. Now that was a surprise. I was surprised. I wasn't sure they would go that far. And if I was surprised, you better believe that Vladimir Putin was surprised. He didn't see it coming. And you can see how angry he was by his remarks the next day, where he reminded everybody that Russia had nuclear weapons. But if you look at the details of what the Russian response was to all of those sanctions, basically locking down over half of Russia's foreign exchange reserves and blocking most of Russia's state banks, and a major export control that's going to hurt Russian industrial production. What we saw in response to that was a series of Russian economic moves, which amounts to taking the Russian economy back to Soviet days of isolation. The Russians demanded that these big Russian companies, the ones that the oligarchs run, and that are the major exporters, turn in 80% of their own foreign exchange bank deposits to the Russian central bank. The Russian government put on capital controls, freezing or limiting the ability of Russians to spend rubles to buy dollars. They're getting very close to making the ruble a non-convertible currency. Now, that may sound like financial wonkiness, but Steve Pifer and I know what a non-convertible ruble means. It means a black market in Moscow and in Russia for dollars. And it means a black market for the things that dollars can buy. It means going back to economic isolation along the Soviet model. And it gets even better. American companies, realizing the extent of financial sanctions, started pulling out of Russia fast. Not all of them. Deutsche Bank, Putin's biggest friend, is still in, but most of the banks are out. McDonald's is out. IKEA is out. MasterCard, Visa are out. And I think it was today that the Kremlin announced that if companies don't come back, the Russians will seize their assets. The Russians have also announced that they are prepared to pay Russian debts in dollars, not in dollars, but in rubles. In other words, default. What this means is that Putin is going back to Soviet levels of economic isolation. Now, this makes perfect sense if you're Vladimir Putin, because the purpose of Soviet economic isolation was to give the Communist Party political control. And if you have to have government permission to get dollars to do foreign trading, it means that you do have this kind of economic political control over the economy, which Putin probably wants. It's his Soviet fetish. He's my age. He was raised in the Soviet Union. He's nostalgic for it. He is betting that the Russian people are equally nostalgic for the Soviet Union. Well, they may on some level be nostalgic for Soviet glory and being the near equal of the United States, but I bet they're not likely for, let's say, food rationing. And guess what? There's sugar rationing back in Moscow, limits on the amount of sugar that people can buy. Moreover, social media companies have backed out of Moscow, or Moscow has shut them down, blocked them. Not YouTube yet, but Twitter, bunches of others. So this is kind of an interesting experiment. Russians your age have been as connected with the rest of the world as their European and American counterparts. And Putin has put a stop to that in about the course of 2 weeks. The ruble is now worth less than a penny. The Russian stock market is closed. I don't know when it's going to reopen, maybe never. The sanctions are going to drive Russia into a deep depression. His military offensive is not going all that well. He's not going to have the resources to build up his military. He is betting that the Russian capacity for suffering is going to be infinite. Well, I can tell you something about the Russian capacity for suffering. It's real when the motherland is under attack. History shows it's not so real when Russia's involved in some foreign war. Now, Putin is going to try to convince his people that the fight against the Ukrainians is the fight against the Nazis. He said so. I'm not sure they'll buy it. I'm not sure they'll buy it. There are some signs now, maybe, rallying around the flag, maybe. I'm not so sure in the long run. There's also not the long-term implications of Putin's economic and political isolation of the world are going to be profound, and they're going to be deep. The Soviet Union collapsed because its economy was doing so badly that the system lost legitimacy. I remember this. I remember by the time we got to the early 1980s, you had the weird phenomenon of Soviet officials praising the superiority of their system, but they wouldn't be caught dead wearing a Soviet-made suit. They knew that their own system had failed in a profound way. Putin is taking them back. I don't know how things will end militarily, how the acute phase of this conflict ends. But we're not going back to a reset. We're going to what John Kennedy, I think, called a long twilight struggle with the Soviet Union, a long twilight struggle with Vladimir Putin. And it could be ugly. Yesterday, the Russians started talking about the Ukrainians developing chemical and biological weapons, which is not true. But that suggests they may themselves use chemical weapons against the Ukrainians. Today, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Zakharova, said that if the West doesn't stop sending advanced weapons to Kyiv, you never know, that could be dangerous for civil aviation in Ukraine or around the world. In other words, a not too subtle threat that somehow bad things could happen to airlines around the world. The Russians are increasing the hysteria and the pressure. I doubt they would be doing this if they felt confident on the battlefield. So buckle up. This crisis is going to get worse before it gets better, and I don't know where it ends. Anyway, on that cheerful note, happy to answer questions.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on to that, it's just kind of, with Putin, he stated the biggest tragedy of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union, and it kind of shows you what his mindset is going into Ukraine, and just looking at all aspects of it through NATO, through sanctions, it's frightening, and and I want to ask you first, Ambassador Fried, looking at Russia being now, I think it was a couple of days ago that they said the U.S. government said that Russia is now the most heavily sanctioned country in the world. And it's not just the federal government, but it's you see these private companies as well, tagging along as well. McDonald's, like you were saying earlier, Coca-Cola, these huge corporations, and in this, looking at the Department of the Treasury and OFAC, they define sanctions as a tool to change the state's behavior and punishing them. Do you see that their behavior changing? I mean, when we look back to North Korea or Myanmar, Iran, looking at these heavy sanctions, these examples show that maybe that these states' behavior it doesn't change, and I think that Russia has calculated that they may be able to and temporarily wait out or use China and other autocracies to help mitigate the sanctions losses. Do you think that the behavior of Russia will change? And if so, how?
Well, I know that OFAC's theology, Treasury theology, is that sanctions are intended to change behavior. But let me tell you, sanctions are also intended to actually hurt the bad guy's economy. In this case, we want to deprive Putin of the resources to commit further aggression. We want to flatten the Russian economy. But let's not pretty it up. We want to change his behavior by crippling him. All right, this is like, let's use clear language here. Can sanctions work? Now, this gets tricky. They seldom work according to the timeline that you've put in your memo to the president or the secretary, okay? The sanctions, look, our economic pressure, and Steve Pifer knows this really well, U.S. economic pressure against the Soviet Union, starting with Carter and then the Reagan administration, was clumsy, inconsistent, controversial, and didn't work, except in the end it really did. Because the effect of all the US economic pressure, as inconsistently applied as it was, meant that the inefficiencies of the Soviet economy couldn't be compensated for with lots of credits and investment. So sanctions don't work until they do. But you also can't snap your fingers, impose sanctions, and expect the bad guys to throw up their hands and say, I surrender. I don't know how this ends with the Russians. I do know that had the US not imposed serious sanctions, we'd be in a lot worse shape.
Absolutely. And passing it off to Ambassador Pifer, I wanted to talk about the best and worst case scenario for Ukraine. If you could speak to that, and is it pragmatic to give what Russia wants and also get what we want in NATO, and trying to find some compromise, or do you think that in itself is impossible? And after Ukraine, do you see, are there any tell signs that Russia will continue through the region and looking at the Baltic states? Even though they are in NATO, there has been a lot of talks about, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. So just wanted to see, what is the end goal for Putin? Just kind of putting yourself in his shoes and his mindset. What is his end state? You're on mute, Ambassador Pifer.
Okay, thank you. I think, the last part of your question, the Baltic states, I think many, I'm not sure Vladimir Putin, but I think many in Moscow accept that when they talk about a Russian sphere of influence, the Baltic states are not in that sphere of influence. The Baltics are in NATO, the Baltics are in the European Union, and he's going to see, I think, a significantly enhanced military presence by NATO in each of those three countries. My guess is, they haven't done it now. I mean, both Ambassador Fried and I worked on the negotiation of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which was established in NATO-Russia relationship. It's time for NATO to basically renounce that. One of the things, a voluntary commitment that NATO took on itself was not to make permanent deployments in those countries. I think it's time for permanent deployments. So I think there will be ways to make it evident to Russia that while NATO has drawn this red line and said it will not send NATO forces into Ukraine to fight in defense of Ukraine, part of the reason that you see these reinforcements going into the eastern flank countries is to make very clear that NATO will fight to defend NATO. And I hope Mr. Putin understands that. On the best case, worst case, I mean, I think the best case for Ukraine is that the Russians find that, in fact, their military can't do it. And they say, well, we really went in there to just destroy the Ukrainian military. We've done that. We've secured the two independent statelets in the east, and we're going home and we'll have a victory parade and declare we won. I don't think that that's likely, but there's a small chance that happens. Again, I think the worst case for Ukraine, which appears to be what Vladimir Putin is aiming for, is again a situation where he takes over perhaps the eastern 2/3 of the country. He puts in place his own government in Kyiv, and then he owns it. He's going to have to occupy it for years. There will be people shooting at his troops for years. He will remain politically isolated. I think that's the condition that sustains Western sanctions. And that's awful for Ukraine. I think that's also actually going to be pretty awful for Russia. But this is where I think it's hard to get a fix on where Putin is going, because I look at this, that seems to be his goal, but just taking a practical look at the outcomes for Russia, I think that's, if that's the win, the winning scenario, I would hate to see what their losing scenario is.
No, absolutely, and this question is for both of you, and looking at, will the transatlantic security last? And so, what have we learned from NATO? NATO's been tested. And what have we learned from them since the Ukraine invasion? Are you both impressed? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of NATO, whether it's enlarging it and looking at possibilities of adding Nordic states like Finland and Sweden? Do you think that's plausible? And is this looking at Article 5 tangential? But do you see an incoming technological revolution playing a role in Article 5, and Russia's cyber attacks on the United States? Is that indirectly an attack? And do you think that will be a trigger looking into the future?
Does anybody think NATO has no purpose? Like, the argument for NATO enlargement looks awfully good right now. And there was a debate, and a reasonable debate, and serious people of goodwill on both sides debated whether the United States was right back in 2008 to push hard to accelerate NATO membership for Ukraine. It failed. Okay, it was a failed effort. Some people say it was a foolish effort. They have good arguments. In retrospect, I'm sorry we didn't succeed, but I understand that. The question is now, what happens and how is NATO done. If you ask the Poles, they'll tell you they will thank God that they are in NATO. And they've thanked the United States for for leading the way to get them in, which we did in the 90s. There's a reason for NATO. It is the security arm of the transatlantic alliance. And it is being put to the test. We will need to maintain a flow of arms to Ukraine to help them defend themselves. Putin will try to intimidate us into stopping it. He has shown that he's not afraid to take aggressive or brutal action. And we have to be prepared to respond. We've lost those habits with respect to Russia. Happily, President Biden is old enough that his Cold War instincts are all still there. His tradition is that of the Democratic Party pre-Vietnam. He came of age in the administration of John F. Kennedy. So he's got the intellectual capital to deal with these issues. And that's important. George H.W. Bush did, for sure. Barack Obama less so, and Donald Trump was, kind of in his heart playing for the other side. He was on the other side. So I think Biden gets this stuff. When he speaks, it seems to me that there's more to it than him reading talking points, which is fortunate because the US government is already making some pretty important decisions in real time on the fly. Sometimes they're messing up, as they did with this whole MiGs thing, Polish MiGs to Ukraine, which is kind of everybody has stumbled on that one. But generally they've gotten it right. I give them credit. And they are likely to face harder decisions in the days and weeks to come.
Let me add 3 points to what Ambassador Fried said. First of all, let's do the counterfactual. Let's say NATO did not enlarge. I think you might still have had a problem with Vladimir Putin because his attitude towards NATO has changed. As Ambassador Fried remembers, back in 2002, Vladimir Putin attended a summit in Rome, a NATO-Russia summit, and he signed on then to a document reinvigorating NATO-Russia relations, knowing full well that later that year there would be a NATO summit at which another round of invitations would be extended to countries, perhaps including the Baltic states. NATO for him has become a problem in the last 10 years because when he came back to the presidency in 2012, he could not use economics to justify regime legitimacy as he did in his first 2 terms because the economics had gone to hell. And so his narrative was Russia nationalism, Russia's a great power, Russia reasserting itself on the world stage, and that narrative required an adversary, and NATO fit the bill. So just imagine now if Putin for domestic reasons is looking to sort of throw his weight around, it wouldn't just be Ukraine that was nervous. You'd have the Baltic states, Poland. There would be a lot of nervousness on the eastern flank of the alliance. Second point I would make is I think NATO has really come together in the last 3 months. Getting some feedback there, sorry, but and I would give the Biden administration a lot of credit because since early December, they have done the hard diplomacy. They've made the phone calls, they've had the meetings, they've consulted, they've coordinated, and it succeeded. They produced, I think, a much more unified alliance than certainly the Russians expected. And you have a situation where in the last 2 major NATO meetings, a virtual summit and then a foreign ministers meeting, the leaders and then the foreign ministers of Sweden and Finland took part. And that should be a worrisome message to the Russians. And finally, just make the last case of how attitudes, I think, in Europe have changed. Look at Germany. In 1 week, Germany swept away 5 decades of its approach towards Russia. They shut down Nord Stream 2. They agreed that Russian banks could be cut from the SWIFT system. On a Saturday, they decided to junk a years-long policy of not providing weapons to conflict zones, and they junked it so they could provide anti-armor and anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine. And then the next day, Germany, the German chancellor announced with regards to defense budgets, bear in mind, Germany has said the NATO goal is to hit 2% of gross domestic product devoted to defense in 2024. Germany was on a track to maybe get that in 2030, maybe not, would see. Last year, they were at 1.5%. The chancellor came out and said, we will hit 2%, and we said we will exceed 2% in our next budget. Oh, and by the way, as a one-time plus up, we're going to put 100 billion euros into defense. Basically, that was 2 years of defense budgets from 2021. So I think you really have seen a galvanized relationship between the United States and NATO, and you have seen a really tectonic shift in how Europe now looks at Russia. And if that's sustained, Russia is going to find NATO is a much more challenging entity to have on its western flank.
Yeah, I'm surprised by the response by Germany as well, especially since Nord Stream 2, and also with Turkey, just knowing Turkey and Russia's relationship and having them kind of step up on their NATO obligations and sending some sort of humanitarian assistance to Poland and thus Ukraine. But no, I wanted to look.
Actually, with Turkey, it's also they're sending, I think, more TB2 drones. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just briefly saw that, and I was a little surprised knowing how uncertain our relationship is with Turkey. But no, looking, kind of looking at Russia's biggest ally right now is China. I know that we're focused on Europe right now, but we can't talk about the Ukraine invasion without briefly bringing up China and their implications and looking from afar. China is looking from afar, and they're in a peculiar position. Just so, how will they proceed? How will China proceed during the Ukraine invasion, and how do you see this playing into the future with Taiwan? And looking at diplomacy, what diplomacy moving forward? Should we? I'm kind of hesitant to bring it up, but the trilateral diplomacy, similar to what we saw with Kissinger during the Vietnam War, are the dynamics just vastly different than they were in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? And if so, do we need to come up with sort of our alternative methods of diplomacy or other tactics that we get a little more creative or out of the box thinking? What is your take on that?
I might start. I mean, I'm not sure that we can successfully find ways to drive wedges between Beijing and Moscow, but I do think that there are actually some latent issues, for example, Central Asia and other questions that these divisions will naturally develop, and we just ought to let them go on their own. But a couple comments about what's going on now. I think President Xi, because it looks so obvious, Putin was there for the opening of the Olympic Games, and then he launched his assault, 3 days after the game closed. Xi looks very much implicated in this. And that has got to be making him uncomfortable, particularly as the Russians are not showing themselves to be very competent in their military operations thus far. And the political difficulties for him are, he's not going to recognize the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk because that sort of undercuts his policy with regards to Taiwan. So I think the Chinese are in a very uncomfortable position. I'm not sure that turns to Chinese pressure on Russia, but I'm also thinking that the Russians may not be getting much help and support from China. And I go back to 2014, I think there was a lot of hope in Russia when the first sanctions were applied after the Russians seized Crimea and supported the breakaway effort in Donbass. And the Russians, I think, had hopes that China would pick up the slack, and the Chinese didn't. I think in part because, one, they saw that engaging financially with Russia could open up some of their banks to sanctions. And I think I've already saw an article saying that the Asian Industrial Investment Bank, which is Chinese led and organized, has already said it's not prepared to now get involved into financing Russia. And I think that's because they don't want to run crosswise with Western sanctions. So I think that's one set of issues. I also think, though, this is not a bad message, because the Biden administration, I agree with Ambassador Fried. You know, it was a total screw up the way they handled the MiG-29 question. That was not just on Washington, but it was on Warsaw, it was on Brussels. Nobody handled that well. I mean, the right thing for happened was nobody said anything, and just all of a sudden 30-odd MiG-29s magically appear in Ukraine, but that's behind us. But I think other than that, you know, you've seen a very competent effort by the administration to marshal a broad range of allies and partners to punish Russia. And that's got to be a message that the Chinese have to take into account. You know, could the United States do that if, in case of it, they moved against Taiwan? And again, while they will be watching to see how effective American sanctions are and what damage they do to the Russian economy. And China, because of its economic relationships, in some ways may have more to lose. So to the extent we succeed in marshaling this effort against Russia, I actually think it probably improves our image and probably gives the Chinese more reasons for second thought in terms of how they want to handle Taiwan.
Ambassador Fried, do you want to add anything to that?
The only thing I'd like, well, I agree with Steve. Secondly, there is a kind of amateur's fallacy to look at China, Russia as part of a board game of Risk. And when people start getting excited about splitting Russia and China, they start talking about what we give Russia, and it usually ends up Ukraine. It's not a board game of Risk. There are real consequences. There's a certain kind of international relations academic who thinks of countries like Ukraine as, you know, peace, like abstractions. The problem with acknowledging a Russian sphere of influence and giving you, quote, giving Ukraine to Moscow is that the Ukrainians have some agency. Back in 2013, there were 0 US tanks in Europe. There were 0 US ground forces in Poland. Ukraine's official policy was neutrality. There was a pro-Putin ruler in charge in Kyiv. And the United States was more or less happy with all of that. But that didn't change because the US was dissatisfied, but because Putin got greedy. He made his guy in Kyiv pull Ukraine so far in a pro-Moscow direction by not signing a modest little trade agreement with the EU that he precipitated riots, well, demonstrations that he repressed, that turned into riots, that turned into his being overthrown. Putin did that. Putin did that because he forced his local guy to do things the Ukrainian population wouldn't accept. My point is that a Russian sphere of influence over Ukraine is inherently unstable and not realistic because it flies against the interests of the Ukrainian people that they have expressed repeatedly for many years. So, you know, stop thinking of it as a goddamn board game, you know, and some abstraction, because it isn't. No, I heard the Trump people talking about it, about giving Ukraine to Putin so he would help us out with China. It was all, they thought it was very sophisticated, and it was a bunch of amateurs. You know, I was a teenage boy once. For an entire year, I played a Risk a lot. That hasn't been the case in many, many decades. Get over it and don't take those attitudes to the White House.
Absolutely, and kind of shifting from, you know, global and kind of going closer to home. And before I ask this question, I want everybody in the audience to come up with, or if you want to ask a question, just think of your question. This is my last one. And looking at the humanitarian aspect of this invasion. Over 2.5 million refugees have fled Ukraine since February 24th, and that they're going to Poland, they're going to Romania, they're going to Moldova. Do you guys have any idea of what's that's going to look like, and how that will affect the surrounding countries, whether it's the Balkan states, these displaced refugees? Do you know that some are going to be sent over to the United States? Can you guys? I know Ambassador Pifer was in Kyiv in early February, but did you get any signs of how they were going to deal with it back then when you were there?
No, I think they are managing it now as best they can. There are also a lot of internally displaced people who have not yet gone to Poland or Hungary or Slovakia, but have just relocated to Western Ukraine. So I talked last week to the person who was my protocol assistant when I was in Kyiv. She's still in Kyiv, but her daughter and her grandkids have moved west. But there is going to be a large flow, and I expect it's only going to increase as long as Russian military activities include. Now, the thing is, I think most of those people are going to want to return as soon as it becomes safe to do so. So I don't think it's a situation where you're looking at them remaining forever, unless, of course, the Russians install a pro-Russian regime, lock it down, and then there may be reluctance of some to go back. But I even think under those, even if the Russians, again, attain what I call that victory where they're occupying, my guess is a lot of Ukrainians have left simply because of concerns about safety. If things were to quiet down, they would go back, and some of them would go back and take part in the resistance.
I'll just add that most of the Ukrainian refugees have gone to Poland, over 1 million. And there are no refugee camps in Poland. Most of these people have been taken into Polish homes or hotels, but they're not being segregated out into refugee camps. And it's quite interesting. I have Polish friends who took in Ukrainian refugees, just like strangers, out of the train station. And that's what people do. And I asked about it, and my Polish friend said, of course we took them in. That used to be us. Ukrainians are popular in Poland and have been for a while. Before the war, there were 1 million Ukrainians living in Poland working. And they learn the language pretty quickly, similar languages, similar culture. The Ukrainians look around at Poland and they say, hey, wait a minute, this is what we want.
Yeah.
The two countries had similar standards of living at the end of the communist period. Now Poland's standard of living is about 4 times that of Ukraine's. That was before the war. Like, the Poles did something right, and the Ukrainians can look around and say, wait a minute, if they did it, so can we. And that's exactly right. Of course, that's right. It's a little harder because Ukraine was post-Soviet as opposed to post-communist, and there is a difference. Sovietism was worse. But, the Poles weren't magicians. What they did is no mystery. So the Poles have been magnificent taking them in. The Ukrainians are popular there. The Poles are going to need a lot of help. I mean, they can't do it forever. Let's hope that Steve is right and that the war will end and people can go back and rebuild.
Perfect. No, thank you so much for being here today, answering all the questions that I had. I'm really excited that we were able to get this event going. So I'm going to open it up to the audience, and it looks like we have a hand raised from Matthew. Matthew, if you want to ask a question, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for both you guys being here today. This has been really insightful. I had a question more about Russia's Pacific side. With the bulk of Russian combat forces being in Ukraine, have they left the Pacific exposed for things like Japan to take back those disputed islands?
No, there's at least half of the Russian ground forces from the Far East Military District are now in Ukraine. I think the Russian army has about 170 battalion tactical groups 125 of which are now in Ukraine. Having said that, Russia also has 1,400 nuclear weapons, and that will probably deter the Japanese from trying to take the islands back. I think the Japanese have now said reasserted sovereignty in political terms, but the Japanese also understand that trying to physically take those back would not be a smart move.
Questions in the group?
Hello, I had a question.
All right, Austin, go ahead.
All right. If Russia is able to take Kyiv and links up with their forces in Odessa, do you believe that the Russians will form their own puppet government as opposed to one that would still exist in West Ukraine? And would they allow the Ukrainian citizens that have been cut off to migrate into that West Ukraine and potentially into Europe? And if so, would that cause a migration crisis?
Oh, man.
No, I would think there would be two possibilities. My guess is that they would install a pro-Russian government. Some think that Putin might actually try to annex part of that back into Russia. Either way, he's going to be faced with a very angry population. Even though it will be backed by the Russian military, other than Eritrea and Belarus, probably no one would recognize a pro-Russian government installed by the Russian military in Kyiv. There would be, my guess is, some people from the Ukrainian government, the current government, would escape to the West, and that would continue to be seen by the West as the real government, even if it was a government in exile. As for whether people would be allowed to leave, I'm just not sure. I mean, if I were the Russian general trying to occupy that, I would be happy to let as many people leave as possible, simply because I think it would reduce the scale of the resistance that I would have to deal with. But I don't know where the Russians would come out on that one.
Perfect. And we have another question in the chat. What are the oligarchs thinking? Are they feeling squeezed? Do they have leverage to push Putin to end the war?
Well, I've heard a report that after Putin summoned the oligarchs and told them to keep quiet, they all went back to their limousines and were talking among themselves and saying, what the hell do we do now? But these aren't independent people. Even the ones that started off in the 90s and made their money through independent actions have either, they've kissed Putin's ring or they're Putin's creatures. That said, even some of the pro-Putin ones, some of the really corrupt ones like Deripaska, have spoken out with doubts about the invasion. Few of them have courage to actually do anything, and I wouldn't bet too much on them, acting against Putin. They don't have a basis to do it. Putin's got all the guns. If Putin's in trouble, it's not going to be because one group or another gets mad. It's going to grow and grow and grow until all of a sudden there's a kind of snap and people have had it. There are lots of scenarios for Russian rulers getting in trouble, especially after unsuccessful wars. It's hard to see how we get from here to there, and regime change is not the US policy objective, nor should it be. It may be a byproduct of what we're doing, but we can't predict that. One of the myths that I remember one of the myths you hear today is the Putin is not the worst. It could be worse, so we'd better, get used to Putin or appreciate him. I've heard that. Many years ago, I used to hear that after Brezhnev, it could be really bad, so we better be nice to him. I'm not sure Putin is the best that Russia can do. In fact, my guess is that a lot of Russians are wondering what the hell Putin has gotten them into. In Russia, even the oligarchs and the politicians who hate the United States send their kids to Western schools. No, Americans, Silicon Valley billionaires don't buy palaces or mansions in Lake Baikal. Okay? They don't dream of taking their vacations in Sochi. It's not symmetrical. And right now, Russians are being cut off, like in the Soviet days. I wonder how they feel about that. We may find out.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, how isolated Russia is becoming. I mean, Russian airlines were banned from Europe, Canada, the United States. And then in kind of a surprising move to me, Aeroflot, as of last Tuesday, is conducting no international flights except to Belarus. And Belarus always struck me. I mean, the one time I went from Minsk to Moscow, I was treated as if I was on a domestic flight, not on an international flight. There were no passport formalities. So I think there's a degree of isolation for Russians who, as their incomes grew in the 2000s, got used to the ability to travel to places like France, to travel to places like Turkey. That's all going to be shut down now. There can be some interesting impacts within Russia. I think I've read that there are 600 Airbuses and Boeings that are primarily doing domestic routes within Russia. Well, as of a week ago, Airbus and Boeing are not only not supplying any spare parts, they're not supplying technical update information. And so the estimate is at some point, and it could be measured, I don't know whether it's weeks or months, all of a sudden those airplanes could become unsafe to fly. So it's not going to be that you just can't fly to London. You're not going to be able to fly, or it's going to be much harder to fly from Novosibirsk to Moscow, unless you want to take chances. So I think the Russian people are going to find that their lifestyle is in for a really, really big change. Now, again, I'm not sure that causes a change at the top, but there is, I think, a certain rigidity and a certain fragility to the structure that Putin has created. If somebody moves against him, and it looks like they'll succeed, my guess is a whole lot of people will jump on that bandwagon if they see that the new person might lead to some end of the situation that Putin has put them in.
Absolutely. And just a follow-up question to that, what does Russia's civil society look like? Their history of how they treated descendants, whether it's anti-war or anybody who wants to challenge Putin. Is there any capacity for a non-strongman politics following Putin?
I know my impression is that the Russians, no, not the Russians, but the Kremlin has systematically compressed the space for independent non-NGOs. I mean, they've now shut down Memorial. Memorial was set up in Soviet times. It operated in Soviet times, and its goal was to basically memorialize the millions of victims of the Gulag. It's now been shut down. The last two sort of really independent media, electronic media, Dosh TV and Echo Moskvy have shut down. One because it's called the invasion. It didn't use the preferred term, which is a special military operation. So I fear in Russia now, the space for civil society has become very narrow. Non-governmental groups that were not seen as operating in a way consistent with the official line have been under enormous pressure. You saw what happened in Navalny's group. Many of his people now have fled Russia because the designation of his group as an extremist organization made them personally subject to arrest. So I don't see civil society organizing. And to my mind, it's going to be just sort of people when they reach the point where they're just tired of the economic pain. But again, I think it's going to even be more so. And this goes back to what led to the pressure in Soviet times against Afghanistan was a mother's organization saying, we don't want our kids to be dying in Afghanistan anymore. Now bear in mind, the Soviet Union lost 15,000 killed in action in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1988. My guess is the Russians in 2 weeks have lost anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 killed in action. That's at some point, I think that may have an impact. I'm not predicting that, but I think that there is a non-zero chance that you begin to have this upswelling of people saying, why are we doing this? It's making our lives more miserable, and our kids are getting killed.
And we've talked about NATO, and I want to talk a little bit about our allies outside of NATO. So, the Mexico's refusal to apply any sanctions on Russia, and then looking at India and our relationship with them, and voting to abstain at the UN Council on the invasion of Ukraine. What does this say about the future with our allies when they're deciding to not work with us, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific or the Western Hemisphere?
Well, it's a mixed picture. Singapore, South Korea, they've signed on to the sanctions, including the economic sanctions. That's important. The Saudis have been in a nasty mood, basically because we don't like their crown prince because he murdered a Washington Post journalist who was a Saudi dissident, and his thugs carved up the guy's body. I mean, this was like, a Quentin Tarantino kind of dictator. They're mad and they say they won't help us with increased oil production. I wonder how long that will last. India has been lukewarm. Israel has tried to play it both ways. But none of these countries is capable of compensating for Russia's economic isolation. They're not going to do it. Most of them can't. Those that can won't. The Israelis are not going to risk, they're not going to help out the Russian economy. They're not going to violate sanctions. The vote at the UN General Assembly condemning Putin's war against Ukraine was overwhelming. So, yeah, we have some work to do, but even, in the 1980s, in the Cold War, the United States never commanded the overwhelming number of countries outside of the developed democracies. And we still did just fine. The Soviet Union doesn't exist. So it's an issue. It's not critical. It would be nice if the Saudis would increase oil production. What did I hear? The UAE is prepared to do so. Anyway, we're working on that. Let's get out of fossil fuels just ever as quick as we can, by the way. Go green.
Easier said than done, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, maybe, except, I remember when wind and solar were kind of left-wing California fetishes.
They still are in California.
But they're not fetishes. They're serious money.
Yeah.
Okay. The two, I think the state that gets the most percentage of its power from windmills is Iowa. They're not politically left. They just count the bucks. So I think it's a lot more green is a lot more plausible than it used to be a generation ago. Let's go for it.
All right, we got another question, Robert.
And I've got to go at 6:30. I've got an interview with a Latin American network about this very issue. So I'm doing my best to try to move the needle on the very question you asked.
Very, very topical. All right, perfect. And last question, Robert, and then we'll wrap it up.
Do you think that the private sector willingly pulling out of Russia surprised Moscow? And then if so, or just in general, why was it such a strong response now compared to other military conflicts in other countries like Myanmar or Venezuela or something like that?
Well, I think,
Go
on.
ahead, Dan. I mean,
The Europeans saw a war in Europe that reminded them of World War II, as it should. And they reacted immediately and powerfully. And Steve outlined some of the flips in German policy. I also think once the United States imposed the sanctions on the central bank and the major Russian banks, it became a lot riskier to do business in Russia. I've been warning American businesses back when I was doing sanctions about the risk premium in Russia, and they probably listened and said, yeah, that's nice. But now it's serious. And the Russians threatening to pay their debts, their dollar debts in rubles, indicate that if you stay in Russia, you're a damn fool. You know, I noticed the Deutsche Bank is going to stay in Russia. I'll bet my old colleagues at Treasury's OFAC that administers sanctions is going to take a real hard look at OFAC. And I would welcome, if I were in government, I'd be looking forward to a full and frank conversation with these guys.
yeah, I would just say, I think actually for big companies, you saw, I think in the case of McDonald's, I mean, first of all, when the ruble lost 30% of its value overnight, that had real profit implications for McDonald's. But I think they also saw simply reputational risk. And then once, you know, there's now kind of this wave now where if you're a company, a Western company still doing in business in Moscow, the question is why? And some of that, I mean, what struck me is the energy companies. I mean, ExxonMobil, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but I think they walked away from a $20 billion investment. And you got to assume that having walked away from that, they're not going back to Russia for a long, long time to come. And the Russians are going to discourage that. I mean, the idea now that they're saying, well, we're going to pay our bills in rubles, you know, companies are going to say, really, that's how you deal with us? There was also, I believe today, they've now authorized Russian companies to go out and steal patents from any company that is based in what they call an unfriendly country. And an unfriendly country is, I think, about 30 or 40 countries in the world. You know, that they're doing things now that I think are not only going to be punitive on themselves, but will ensure that they don't see Western companies coming back in for a long time to come. And then the question becomes, in their economy, which is not going to be performing very well. I think I've seen one expectation that the GDP of Russia will probably contract by 10% this year, but they're not going to see any Western companies ready to make investments back in there when they see, you know, what happened and how the Russians behaved.
Great last question, Robert. No, I thank you both so much for being able to attend today. I know you have something to attend, so I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, or Ambassadors, Ambassador Freed and Ambassador Pifer, and from the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine. Thank you. Have a great day, and thank you again for this discussion.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.